In the quiet of an Arizona neighborhood, there was a house that looked ordinary from the outside. A front door, a driveway, a place where friends gathered, where phone calls were made, where someone came home after work and expected tomorrow to arrive just like any other day. For several days in June of 2008, no one outside that house truly understood what had happened inside it. There were missed calls, unanswered messages, plans that no longer made sense. And then, when friends finally entered the home, the silence became something else. Not a mystery of whether something had gone wrong, but a mystery of how a relationship that had once seemed full of hope, attention, and promise had ended in such a devastating way. At the center of it were two people. A young man with a wide circle of friends, strong religious commitments, and ambitions that kept him moving forward. And a young woman who had once been close to him, who had traveled hundreds of miles, changed parts of her life, and later told more than one version of what happened. Before the courtroom. Before the cameras. Before the long trial that would become a national obsession. There was only a house in Mesa, and a question that would quietly unfold into one of the most closely watched true crime cases in modern American history. Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we are looking at the case of Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander, a documented true crime story involving a complicated relationship, a shocking crime, and a trial that drew years of public attention. As always, this episode is told calmly and respectfully, with no graphic detail and no sensational framing. The focus is on the people, the timeline, the investigation, and the documented facts that help the jury reach its decision. This is a true crime story for sleep, quiet listening, or a black screen evening. So settle in, lower the lights, and let the story unfold slowly. Travis Victor Alexander was 30 years old in June of 2008. He lived in Mesa, Arizona, a city east of Phoenix, surrounded by desert light, suburban streets, and the everyday rhythm of work, church, friends, and plans for the future. Travis was known by many people as outgoing. He worked in sales and motivational speaking, and he was connected to a wide social circle through business, travel, and his faith community. He was also a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and his faith shaped many parts of his public life, his friendships, and the expectations he held for himself. People who knew Travis often described him as energetic and social. He liked to talk. He liked to make people laugh. He was ambitious, sometimes restless, and often surrounded by people. But like many real people, Travis's life was not simple. Behind the public confidence and the polished smile was a person who had grown up through difficulty, who had worked to build a more stable adult life, and who was still trying to reconcile private choices with public values. Jodi Ann Arias was born in California. By the time she met Travis, she had worked in photography and service jobs and had moved through different parts of the western United States. Jodi and Travis met in 2006 at a business convention in Las Vegas. The setting mattered. It was the kind of event where people were dressed well, speaking confidently, and imagining a larger future for themselves. For Jodi, Travis stood out. For Travis, Jodi did too. Their connection moved quickly. They spent time together, talked often, and began a relationship that would eventually become long-distance, intense, and difficult. At first, there was excitement. There were long conversations. There were visits between California and Arizona. There was the feeling, at least for a time, that something meaningful had begun. Jodi later converted to Travis's faith. That choice would become part of the story told around them, though it is important to treat it carefully. Faith did not cause what happened. Religion did not create the violence. But it was part of the world they lived in, and part of the tension between what they hoped to be and what their relationship became. Over time, the relationship changed. Friends of Travis later said they were concerned. They described their relationship as turbulent. There were arguments, jealousy, boundaries crossed, and emotional conflict. Jodi and Travis broke up, but contact did not end. That is one of the quiet patterns in this case. The relationship was over in one sense, but not over in another. They still communicated. They still saw each other. They still had unresolved emotional ties. And when a relationship continues after its ending, the lines can become blurred. Hope can sit beside resentment. Affection can sit beside anger. One person may want distance while the other wants closeness, or both may move back and forth, unsure how to stop something that is already causing pain. By early 2008, Travis was trying to move forward socially and romantically. He had plans to travel to Mexico with friends. At one point, Jodi had been associated with those plans, but the trip became part of the prosecution's later theory about motive. The state would argue that Jodi was angry and jealous because Travis planned to travel with another woman. Jodi's defense would argue something very different. Her attorneys claimed that Travis had been abusive and that Jodi acted in self-defense. These opposing views would later sit at the center of a long trial. But before any jury heard those arguments, there was a final trip. In June of 2008, Jodi Arias drove from California toward Arizona. The exact meaning of that trip would later become one of the most important questions in the case. Was it planned as a visit? Was it hidden? Was it part of something premeditated? Or was it, as Jodi would later suggest in different ways, a meeting that turned suddenly and terribly wrong? The answer would depend on evidence, receipts, phone records, photographs, a damaged camera, a rental car, gas cans, and the many stories Jodi Arias told before finally admitting she had been there. On June 4, 2008, Travis Alexander was at his home in Mesa. Jodi Arias was there too. For a time, no one outside the house knew that. The two spent hours together. Photographs recovered later showed that they were both inside the home that day. Some images were private in nature, and others placed Travis in the bathroom in the period before his death. For this script, we will not linger on those images. It is enough to say that investigators recovered digital evidence that became central to the case. At some point that day, Travis was killed. The crime scene was deeply disturbing, and the medical details were discussed extensively in court. But the important fact for our purposes is this: Travis died violently inside his own home, and the prosecution later argued that the attack was deliberate and premeditated. Afterward, days passed. Friends became worried when Travis did not respond. He had plans. He was expected places. His silence was not normal. On June 9, 2008, friends went to his home. Inside, they found him. From that moment, the case shifted from concern to investigation. Police were called. The home became a crime scene. Detectives began working backward from the last known movements of Travis Alexander and the people who had been in his life. Jodi Arias was not immediately presented to the public as the person responsible. At first, she denied being there when Travis died. Then, she gave a different version. Later, she gave another. This changing account became one of the defining features of the case. In her earliest statements, Jodi denied involvement. Then she suggested that intruders had been responsible. Later, she admitted she had killed Travis, but claimed it had happened in self-defense. For investigators, and later for jurors, The question was not only what Jodi said, it was what the evidence showed. The investigation into Travis Alexander's death quickly became a case built from small pieces. One of the most important pieces was a digital camera found at the home. It had been damaged and placed in a washing machine, but investigators were still able to recover images from it. Those photographs helped place Jodi Arias with Travis on the day he died. They also helped establish a timeline inside the house. In many investigations, time is the quiet spine of the case. When was the victim last seen alive? Who was present? What evidence places someone there? What changed before and after the crime? In this case, the recovered photographs gave investigators a sequence that was difficult to ignore. There was also Jodi's travel. The prosecution later argued that she had taken steps to conceal her trip to Arizona. Evidence presented at trial included discussion of a rental car and gas cans, which the state used to suggest planning and an attempt to avoid leaving a clear trail. Jodi's defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation. But the state's larger argument was that the trip was not spontaneous in the innocent way Jodi wanted jurors to believe. Detectives also looked at phone records. They studied contact between Jodi and Travis. They examined the aftermath. And they paid close attention to Jodi's own statements. Her changing stories mattered. At first, she said she was not there. Then, when evidence made that impossible to maintain, the story changed. Eventually, she admitted she was present and that she had killed Travis, but said she had feared for her life. This created the central courtroom conflict. The prosecution said Jodi Arias murdered Travis Alexander because she was angry, jealous, and unwilling to accept his movement away from her. The defense said Travis had been abusive and that Jodi reacted in fear during a confrontation. A jury would have to decide whether the killing was premeditated murder, self-defense, or something else. The trial began in January 2013 in Maricopa County, Arizona. By then, the case had already drawn attention, but the courtroom proceedings turned it into a national story. There were several reasons. First, Jodi Arias testified for many days. Second, the relationship between Jodi and Travis was described in unusually personal detail. Third, the trial was televised and discussed widely in the media. And fourth, the case involved contradictions that many people found difficult to look away from. Jodi could appear calm and soft-spoken. The crime was anything but calm. Travis was remembered by family and friends as loved, funny, and full of life. The defense presented a darker picture of the relationship. The prosecution presented Jodi as manipulative and calculating. The defense presented her as frightened and damaged. The courtroom became a place where two very different narratives competed. But trials are not meant to decide which story is more dramatic. They are meant to decide what the evidence proves. On May 8, 2013, the jury found Jodi Arias guilty of first-degree murder. The case then moved into a long and painful sentencing phase. Arizona law at the time allowed the death penalty to be considered in certain first-degree murder cases. Jurors, however, could not reach a unanimous decision on that punishment. A second jury also could not reach a unanimous decision. In 2015, a judge sentenced Jodi Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Years later, in 2020, the Arizona Court of Appeals upheld her conviction and sentence. That legal outcome is important because it places the case in its final documented posture. Jodi Arias remains convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. What remains after the headlines fade is not the spectacle of the trial, It is the quiet loss at the center of the story. Travis Alexander was 30 years old. He had friends who expected him to answer the phone. He had plans on the calendar. He had family members who would have to hear his name repeated in court again and again, attached to evidence, arguments, and theories. And he had a life that became publicly known, not because of everything he hoped to do, but because of the way it ended. That is one of the saddest parts of true crime. A person becomes famous for the worst thing that ever happened to them. In this case, the trial became a national conversation about obsession, jealousy, intimacy, faith, media attention, and truth. But beneath all of that was a simpler reality. A man was killed in his home. A woman who once loved him was convicted of his murder. And a relationship that began in a bright, crowded convention space ended in a quiet house in Mesa, with consequences that could never be undone. The Jodi Arias case still draws attention because it contains so many contradictions. Soft voice and severe crime. Affection and resentment. Denial and confession. Private messages and public testimony. A life built around ambition, friendship, and faith, ending in a courtroom record. For listeners, the lesson is not to stare at the violence. It is to notice the warning signs that can appear when a relationship becomes unstable. Possessiveness, boundary crossing, fear, control, the inability to let go. Not every painful relationship becomes dangerous. Most do not. But when emotions become tangled with obsession, and when conflict grows instead of resolving, distance and support can matter. Travis Alexander's story is remembered because of the trial. But it should also be remembered as the story of a person. A son. A brother. A friend. A man who made people laugh. A man whose life had meaning before anyone outside his circle knew his name. And in the stillness after the case, that is where the story should rest. Not in the noise of the courtroom, not in the glare of the cameras, but in the memory of a life interrupted. Thank you for listening tonight. This has been a calm, true crime story for sleep, told with respect for the victim, the people affected, and the documented facts. As the screen stays dark and the room grows quiet, take a slow breath, let the story fade, and rest.